like, just a couple of notes that are lingering from chapter 6 before we get to chapter 7 of Joshua. So if you would, you can just turn to the ending portions of Joshua chapter 6, and I will share a tab with you with my notes so that you can see my translation. And let's see what we got here. Okay, here we go. So I want to reread a brief portion here from chapter 6, verse 17 through to the end, so that we can make some comments about this ending section of chapter 6, and then we'll move on a little bit to chapter 7. So starting at 6:17, it says, "The city of Jericho shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them and take some of the things under the ban and make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to Yahweh. They shall go into the treasury of Yahweh." So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And when they heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman and young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all that she has out of there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rachab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all that she had. And they also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of iron, bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of Yahweh. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates." So Yahweh was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So that, and we talked about some of that prior to this evening, but there are just a couple of additional points that I want to bring out in regards to chapter 6, the end of chapter 6. Number one is the issue of the curse, the ban, however your text renders that, of the curse or the ban being placed upon Jericho. Now, why do you think that this curse was placed upon Jericho? Why were all of the people and the goods and everything placed under the ban, and what does that even mean, under the ban? What are your thoughts about that? Anybody? Well, I believe we mentioned before when we started, this is actually our third session in talking about chapter 6. We mentioned before that word is cherem, Cherem, which is kind of hard to translate. It's basically saying that it is dedicated. Cherem is actually similar to the word chodesh, which is holy. It is holy, but it doesn't have the specificity of the word kodesh. Holy to God is kodesh. Cherem just means dedicated. Doesn't have the specificity. But in most cases that you see it used in your Bible, it is translated as cursed, banned, set aside. You hear the word harem. Does it sound like any word that you've heard before? You know the word harem. What is a harem? It is like a king's group of wives that are housed separately. They are under the ban. That Arabic word is translated from this Hebrew word, and it means literally that king's wives are banned to all men and are dedicated to him. In this context, it is saying that everything in Jericho that is alive and all of the goods, except for those goods that are durable, metals, are to be burned up completely with fire. Killed and burned completely with fire.
Do you think there is a relevance in it? I think it mentioned 2 times that there are 4 metals. I don't know if there are certain relevance. Gold, silver, bronze, and iron.
Yes. Yes, I do think so, and I will say this. This, it reminds me of when we were looking in the book of Leviticus, talking about ritual purification, and it was talking about applying ritual purity to objects. There were certain things, like things made out of wood and stone and clay, that can be washed with water, but that things that were made out of metal needed to be purified by fire. But what's weird about this case is that everything living, which normally wouldn't pass through the fire, are burned, and the metals doesn't say anything about them being purified by fire. But although it's certainly possible, if they set the whole city on fire, everything's going to burn, but those metals are going to be easily recoverable. And it's not likely that those fires would have gotten hot enough to melt metal, not necessarily. So it would have been easy to go back through the ashes and just rake the metal out. And so all of the metal implements, whether silver or gold or iron or bronze, copper, whatever, could be collected and sent to the treasury of Yuvah. So everything in that city was dedicated to destruction. And it's almost of that same idea where we talked about the sacrificial system in the book of Leviticus, where it talked about things being burned and going up in smoke to God, so to speak. That smoke goes up into heaven, well, I guess it's going to God. Well, that's basically what happened to everything in Jericho. It went up in smoke and went up to God. It was dedicated to God. Yes, Jerry?
I think it's in the 2 Corinthians chapter 5 where it talks about the Bema or the judgment seat of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that we do is going to be, that we've done in this life, which is supposedly works for the kingdom,
right,
is going to be tried in the fire, and the gold and the silver and the stuff that
wood, hay, and stubble,
is going to be saved, and the junk is going to be burned up and blown out with the wind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that would tie into that or not, but
it certainly is a wonderful, wonderful insight, Jerry, because I think that notice what survived in Jericho.
the stuff of value.
Well, think about it a little bit more deeply. All of the valuable metals survived,
Right.
as well as Rahab and her family.
And all of her stuff.
And all of her stuff.
So
now, did she survive through the fire? No, she was taken out before the fire was struck. However, she did, if you want to look at it that way, she survived the flames.
It was something else.
Yeah.
Last week we were talking about where was her house on the wall?
Oh, yeah.
And I've been thinking just now, the spies she took up to the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So the house must have had to be near the top of the wall.
Yep.
Yeah, it's
That's just
certainly possible.
deductions.
Yeah.
Was she raptured?
She was raptured, yes. Rahab was raptured out of Jericho, absolutely.
To the top of the wall.
No,
It was up on her.
I thought it was on her
of
roof.
house.
The
Yeah.
roof of her house.
And so she may have had like really 2 or 3
Stories.
Stories. Yeah.
stories, and then the roof,
Could be,
so that it wouldn't be out into the city street or
Be like a
something.
castle.
right,
So,
right,
it's just
yeah.
she knew that they would be safe up there, and in the regular house, if they came in and looked, they'd look, but they wouldn't look up on the roof.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody know what happened to Jericho later on in the biblical record?
It's rebuilt and 2 kids died.
Yeah, it was rebuilt in the time of the judges, as far as I remember. But it's interesting that this territory where the city of Jericho resides was given to the tribe of Benjamin, and it appears that they did build in that area, but it wasn't until the time of Ahab, actually, that the city of Jericho was rebuilt, and the curse was enacted, where that guy who rebuilt the city had that curse come down on his children.
That's why it says the man that rebuilt.
Right.
Rather than the M-E-N.
Right. And what's interesting is that it is suggested that that was a good area to build in, and that there were plenty of houses there, but scholars seem to suggest that what Joshua was talking about when he was talking about rebuilding Jericho, notice that it says a foundation stone and hanging the gates. I believe that the historical and the archaeological records suggest that more houses were built in that area, but that did not enact the curse. It was when they set the foundation stone of a wall to build a fortified city and then hung the gates of the city that those curses were enacted. And you might ask yourself, well, if that's true, that building was going on there, maybe even in the city area, but it was when someone decided to build that back into a fortified city with city gates and a city wall that the curse was enacted. Why do you think that might be? Angela?
I don't know.
What do you think? What do you think about? Sorry, I'm picking on Angela. Well, it just you had mentioned something before about fortified cities, didn't you?
Well, I was talking about the great city, which yes, there's walls, gates, and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's.
When we were talking, I was talking about the great.
Yeah, she was talking about the great city. I think that it's possible that this idea of building this city as a fortified city, and the reason that we see fortified cities being destroyed, especially in the coming chapters of Jericho, and this is a theme that we'll have to discuss in a little bit more detail, is that some of these fortified cities seem to represent this hostile, fortified attitude toward God, and that these people are shut up in their fortified cities, insulated from God, proud, and insulated in some way. But I don't know. There's probably more of a. I have here.
Alan?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hey, since we met last time before the break, I went looking because we had talked about the falling of the walls in the last session.
Yeah.
And Patterns of Evidence, Exodus by Tim Mahoney. Are you familiar with that movie?
I am.
Documentary?
Yeah.
They go into detail showing how the walls fell and how a section, they even proved archaeologically the section where Rahab was, how it stayed up. And they actually talk to some of the archaeologists and stuff, and they show the records in the books where they found that section that was still preserved. And how all the grain was still in the bags and everything, that it wasn't a very long siege because they didn't eat all their spring grain. Because we know that Joshua came in the spring, right? So they had just harvested the barley.
Right.
And then, so it was very interesting, and it's all factual, and if you get a chance to see that, and everybody else, if they've got their hands on that, it's a real good review.
Yeah, I enjoyed that movie quite a bit. It's been several years since I've seen it, but if you haven't seen it and you get a chance to, it's called Patterns of Evidence, The Exodus, I think, something like that.
Exodus, yeah. That's the first one of 4.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know, I think it was on Netflix or Amazon or something the last time I checked it, so, take a look. I didn't realize, though, Keith, that there were possibly other episodes in the series, is that correct?
Yeah, then they've got the next one is the writing of the Torah with Moses. Could Moses write the Torah or not? Because scholars are basically discrediting Moses with writing the Torah.
Sure.
So he goes and proves that Moses wrote the Torah.
Yeah.
And then the next ones are making their way to the sea and all the waypoints that are mentioned in the Bible, getting over to the Red Sea and then the crossing.
Yeah.
So he's up to the point where he's got him crossing the sea. His next one is going to be in the land of Midian, showing the mountain.
I have
So
not.
he's still working on that one. That was the fifth.
I haven't seen the others, but I would definitely like to see those because I thought that the first one that I saw was actually pretty cool. It was very well done.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thinking Man Films is his moniker, and he actually does show both sides. He lets the critics say their thing, but then he shows the proofs that I believe anybody with faith can really see through the critics.
Would they give that name? Who did give that name?
We
The
did the first.
The one that he goes by. The name.
Oh, what was it? Thinking Man Films.
Yeah, if you look up Thinking Man Films or even patternsofevidence.com, you can see he's got all the Blu-rays and DVDs for purchase. I don't know if those are on Netflix or not. You can always look them up.
The first one used to be. I don't know if it is still, but yeah, take a look at it if you get an opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Keith. That's a good insight, and I think that's especially important because it's right here where we're studying in Jericho, and I remember seeing them do some archaeological digs there at the site of Jericho, and I saw some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, his name's Tim Mahoney.
Tim Mahoney.
I thought it was Tim something.
Cool. Thank you, Keith. So a final note that I want to make in regards to chapter 6, verses 23 and 25 is in regard to Rahab and her family. When I look at the principle of Rahab and her entire family being rescued from destruction, what does that remind you of? Are there other biblical examples of that, Jimbo?
Noah's Ark.
Noah's Ark, yeah. We get the revelation given to Noah, and he is able to rescue his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, so that whole family is rescued. Anything else?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot. The angels go and tell him, go and find, get your family and bring them. And he tried to bring his sons-in-law, but they thought he was they laughed at him and thought he was joking or something. So that's fascinating to me that issue of salvation is granted with such wide latitude that it's like it really jars against your sensibilities regarding, well, only the righteous are saved, only you got to have this or that or this or that in order to be rescued. That does not seem to be the case for the biblical record. I mean, it's hard to imagine also that everybody who came out of the Exodus who decided to paint blood on their doors was a perfectly righteous individual who was full of faith and holding up the promises. God knows how many Egyptians and other pagans decided, well, you know what? These people seem to be protected, so we're just going to try to imitate them. Yeah, we're going to go with them and just kind of imitate them. Now, don't hear me making statements that you ought to just go ahead and say, you know what? I think I'll just go ahead and associate myself with the Christians and I'll be okay. I don't think that's the case. And yet, God's grace seems to be abounding and expanding beyond what we would look at as being righteous or just. Rahab was the only one who took any action to, be faithful. She believed in her mind that the God of Israel was great and that they were going to be victorious, and she's the only one who took action on that belief to make herself a friend of Israel. And yet, it sounds to me from the text like a whole gaggle of people were rescued from there.
The only other side of the coin I've got in my head is the foolish virgins who were outside.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were virgins. They were doing things right.
The only difference is, and I'm picking up on what you're saying, the only difference is those virgins, all of them, seem to be, because they're virgins, because they know that there's a bridegroom coming, because they are associated with the bridegroom,
More responsibility.
they have a lot more responsibility.
Right.
They're members of the covenant. They're members of the family. Some of them more faithful than others. But it seems like, and we see the issue of the guy on the cross next to Christ, who doesn't seem like he did anything good in his life, ended up hung on a cross next to Jesus for actual crimes, was said, you'll join me in paradise. So I think we just need to remember that God is gracious. However, we have a greater responsibility as members of God's household who have been entrusted with a tremendous amount of truth, that we're much more responsible for that. Jerry?
Be not teachers.
I think that God extended grace to each of these people, like Noah, Abraham. What's the other one I'm thinking of? Job. And because of their faith and the grace that God extended to them, God granted them salvation. Basically, I mean, and Job was a little different. He lost everything, but then when it was all over,
Got everything back.
he got another family, and it seems like he got twice as many cows and sheep and stuff.
Yeah,
Whatever it was, I
Right.
guess he was a farmer. I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
You're right.
yeah.
So that goes to show that back in those days, they must have lived a couple hundred years. You
Yeah.
don't have one family lose the whole thing and then
Start over.
start over and have another one.
Yeah, indeed. No, I think that's good. That's a good point. It occurs to me too, thinking about Rahab, and you can picture it with Lot, because the text says so, that he goes and talks to his family and tries to persuade them to come. We don't get that in the text from Noah, but with Rahab, I just have in my mind a picture of Rahab going to her family. What's she going to say to them? I'm having a party. Make sure you're here. Is she going to tell them the truth?
Yep.
I met with some Israelites and I made them a promise. If you come, is she going to tell them the truth of what the situation is? I mean, what if one of her family members decides to turn on her and say, "Hey," they go to the authorities and say, "Rahab turned us over, man." There's a lot of danger there for Rahab in telling her family the truth. Who knows how she did it, but I have to imagine in my mind that the Spirit was empowering her as she spoke to her family and her friends, and the Spirit was with her family and friends in their ears as they heard the words, so that they could be rescued, because there's so much difficulty involved in that situation. Gracie?
I don't know how it was back then. She was a harlot.
Either that or
I
an
don't know
innkeeper.
what her family thought of her and her lifestyle, that they would even take her word for anything.
Yeah, true that.
I think they may have seen a change in her, and she was a different person,
Yeah, maybe.
and they went,
Well, how
This
much?
woman's had
Well, okay,
has
so that's
experience.
possible, but she didn't. We know that she didn't take any action until the spies actually came. Is it possible that she had already had a change of heart before she even met the spies? Because between the time that she met the spies and the walls are attacked, doesn't seem like it's that much time. They wouldn't have had a lot of time for her to change behavior, but. If she heard about the God of Israel, I don't know what. I mean, I have to imagine that everybody in that part of the world certainly knows what happened to Egypt, but do they know the guiding principles of the Torah, or have they heard from somebody? I mean, they've been wandering around in the desert for 40 years. Do you think any of these Israelites are meeting with other members of the public outside of the camp of Israel and saying, "Man, we heard from God, and here's some of our things that He's taught us"? Why not? I don't know. It's possible that she could have learned some things and begun to change, but I don't know. Tammy?
Well, just like you had said earlier about the thief on the cross, he didn't have time either.
Right.
And so it could be possible she didn't have time.
Right.
But she did, she realized what was going on. And so,
Yeah.
Just
She
like
took action
he-
at the last minute.
yeah, and so did he. And so, in a way, it does kind of show that sometimes in the last moment, somebody maybe realizes, wait a minute, there
Yeah.
really is God, and really has, in that moment, a change of heart.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
You know, I'll say one thing before you, Jimbo. I remember my father-in-law said something to me one time when I was talking to him about some theological issues, and he said, you know, whenever you hear someone presenting the truth about the Bible, and it seems to you like God is just waiting for any slightest hint of faith and opportunity to snatch someone out of the flames of hell, that's the God of the Bible. That if you're getting involved in something that somebody's saying you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to do this or you're not going to make it, that is not the gospel. And I agree with that 100%. Faith, you know, salvation comes by faith. Now we know as mature believers that we have to take action. There's no question about that. But God is desperate to save anyone whose heart is willing to hear him. I believe that very much, very much.
I don't remember what culture it was that that my missionary went to and had an impact. It was in Africa. Brutal cannibalism, all about power struggles and manipulating demons. And when the people learned the language enough to talk, one of the first things they said was, I knew we were all messed up. I knew we were screwy, and I just needed the truth and the light to get out of this horrible situation.
Yeah.
And some of them, of course, wanted to maintain it.
And I think that speaks to Paul's points that he makes in the first chapters of Romans, where that spirit, there's a nugget of that spirit that is left in every human being, that conscience says very clearly to you, whether you know the gospel or not. Something is not right about what's happening in your life or your country or your children.
Nothing really satisfies.
No, yeah, absolutely, I agree. Now, go ahead, Carla.
Just an observation, about how Rahab would have come to ask for her being spared from this. She makes a few comments in Joshua 2, and she says she knows that Yehovah has given them the land, and the terror of them has fallen on us, she says, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. We've heard how Yehovah dried up the water of the Red Sea, and she goes on and talks about that. And then she acknowledges that Yehovah, your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. So she has a belief, I think, quite a while before they actually come. Mm-hmm. And it's probably, maybe they've even talked about it in the city because they all are fearful of the Israelites. And, you wonder how, if everybody was wiped out of the Egyptians at the Red Sea, or even if people were watching the crossing of the Jordan, who was there to report that? Mm-hmm. Because everybody knows about it. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of travelers that may have seen things, and certainly they've had to be on a route to trade, and Jericho's a big trade area. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to spread the word.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's every reason to believe that, as I mentioned a minute ago, 40 years have gone by since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And yes, I have to believe that there is some trade and some interaction happening between the Israelites and the peoples around them. Certainly,
everywhere they went, they had to talk. They had to deal with somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the text doesn't tell us specifically that they interacted with other people, but there are people all over that area. I mean, yeah, they're in the wilderness. They're certainly out of the beaten path. But there are Moabites and Edomites and Arabs and Ethiopians. They're all over that area. So it makes you wonder about what kind of information was seeping out of the nation of Israel into the nations around them. I mean, certainly they're going to hear about the destruction of, the army of at the Red Sea and certain things like that. But it makes me wonder how much of that truth, of God's truth and the right character for, right action and morals and left and right and, right and wrong, how much of that had leached out into the people around them. And maybe some scoffed, but some, like Rahab, might have heard these things and said, I totally believe that. And I might like to get down on that. If only I could live through the Holocaust that is coming to destroy us all. And she took action to save herself and her family. Who was going to speak here? Was it Jimbo?
Yeah, there was, I forget which people it was, but they capitulated.
The Gibeonites?
Yes. Yeah,
Through trickery, is that what you mean?
Yeah, through
Yes.
trickery. And so they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation.
Right.
They were allowed to assimilate in a limited fashion.
Right.
Some hard work.
Sure.
They got slaves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can see this.
Joshua 9.
They saw what Jehovah did, and they feared Jehovah. And
Yes, they
that's why
did.
God
It
said-
wasn't kidnapped slaves, they were like,
Right.
what do you call them, indentured servants?
Indentured servants. Yeah,
You know,
and
it
they're
says
still.
they'll never cease being slaves.
Well, they're still around in the times of the King Saul and King David, and it doesn't appear that they are still serving in that way a couple of hundred years later. They are now integrated into the tribes of Benjamin, and they are considered to be part of Israel in the days of King Saul and King David. So that's something to look at. It's certainly fascinating. One thing that I want to bring to your attention before we move out of chapter 6, and that is there's just so much happening in chapter 6, and I know we've spent like 3 weeks talking about chapter 6, but the one thing that caught my attention here is that it says that when they destroyed the city, they took Rahab and her family and they set them outside of the camp of Israel. But then, like a sentence or two later, it says that they reside in the midst of the camp of Israel to this day. So something happened, and it makes you think about, what was that transition? Why did they set them outside of the camp, and then how did they come to in the midst of the camp? Jerry?
I think maybe that was because they were unclean and they had to go through that 7 days of
Good point.
purification. And then after 8
Good
days,
point.
whatever it was, it's like when they cleansed the temple.
Yeah, that is a
Then
great
they could come
insight.
back into the camp,
There you go.
part of the,
Yep. That is the first thing in my notes that says, does this suggest a period of cleansing? I do believe that you could be right about that they could have been defiled in any number of ways
It's
and
really great
needed
what
to
great
be.
minds think alike.
That's right. I think they could have needed to be purified, ritually purified, or they couldn't really be inside the camp at all. They have to, I mean, that when you hear that expression outside the camp, it is almost exclusively used for ritual impurity in the book of Leviticus. So that makes good sense.
They had leprosy.
Yeah,
Moses' sister,
leprosy, Moses' sister. Yeah, so you hear all about that in the book of Leviticus, and so it does suggest to me that that there was a period of ritual impurity that they were under, or they were under ritual impurity, and they needed to go through a cleansing. So was it only a 7 days type of thing, and they sprinkled some of that water from the red heifer on them? I don't know. We don't really know what the period of.
They even have the red heifer back then?
Yeah. I mean that instruction had been given already, but it makes you wonder about is there a conversion process? I mean, did Rahab and her family need to? They're like proselytes. They have become attached to Israel, and it says in the second sentence that they are now in the midst. It makes you wonder about the ritual impurity. It makes you wonder about did they need to be kept outside and kind of learn some of the ways. It also makes me think of Acts chapter 15, where it's like, okay, you guys have been rescued and you've been saved, and we want you to be able to join us. You must be ritually purified before you're able to come into contact with anybody in this camp, but also you might be in the habit of living your life in these ways, which are totally antithetical to the way that we do things here. So you need to learn not to engage in idolatry, sexual immodesty, impurity, eating these types of foods. And by the way, we have a Torah. That's chapter 15 of Acts, saying if you want to join into this community, these are the 4 basic hoops that you need to jump through in order to become full-fledged members of this community. And it says that over time they did move into the midst of Israel. Jerry?
If she was a prostitute, she might have been involved in sexual impurity.
She might
Just
have.
might have been.
She might have been. Yeah, absolutely. She might have had some sexual impurity if she was a prostitute. So yeah, they might have been kept at arm's length and tested for a time with ritual impurity, learning some of the basic things.
Yeah, I have a couple. One thing about that would be, my question would be, so would they maybe have the men have to be
Circumcised? That's a great question.
The other but the question I've really had is, and we may have gone over this, but apparently I missed it. The men that went in to search out the land and came back, and only Joshua and Caleb agreed, and so they had to wait. Was it 20 more years, or 40 years?
40.
Until the older soldiers died off.
Yeah.
So was that when Rahab took care of the spies? So she waited all that time till she saw them coming and the walls came down.
Well, no. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, this is...
Did they send just a few spies in then at that time? Was it 2 separate times?
2 separate times, that is correct. Yes, there were 12 spies who went in during the times of Moses. But this time, Joshua sends only 2 spies. Okay. And it's obviously not Joshua and Caleb, because they're old and I'm assuming they're leaders of the congregation at this time. So, yes, great question. As far as whether the men of this clan of Rahab would need to be circumcised, that's a great question. If they wanted to become full-fledged members of Israelite society, I would say that they probably would have said yes. If you want to be a full-on member, the males will have to be circumcised. What other minimum requirements would there be for these people to integrate with Israelite society? As far as the males being circumcised, I mean, there are no other requirements aside from like Acts 15 type of stuff. If you behave in a certain way, you could get killed, first of all, because we have the death penalty for certain crimes in this society. You need to know these things.
And in the New Testament, until they were ready to meet the requirements, they weren't allowed at the synagogue. So these people may not have even been allowed even into the outer court.
That is my assumption is that and that's one of the other notes that I put here is, do we keep them at arm's length for a time until they learn how to integrate and how to get along with our society? They need to, yeah, absolutely.
To do the Passover, they had to be circumcised.
Yeah, to do the Passover, they certainly would have had to have been circumcised. If they wanted to become full-fledged members of Israelite society, the males would have been circumcised, I presume. However, if you're just going to reside outside the camp and not be subject to the death penalty, you've literally been removed from the law of cherem that we talked about previously. They escaped that. But if you want to join us, there are some different things that you're going to have to do, and that might take some time. So I don't know how long they would have spent outside the camp. Go ahead, Carla.
I'm just thinking how I see a relationship with this to when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, because there were a number of Egyptians that joined them in leaving, and they were truly a mixed multitude.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really specify that I recall that those Egyptians were required to do certain things. It was that if they from
Yeah.
the children of Israel.
Well, that's a great insight, Carla, and I think most of the Bible scholars, and I think us ourselves, as we study through this, see that indeed any one of the nations that were in Egypt were certainly allowed to paint the door of the blood on their to paint the blood on their door and leave with the Israelites and not get killed. However, how long was it before they actually received the instruction of the Torah? According to all accounts, it's like 40 days, right? You got to count 49 days after Passover, and then you get to Shavuot. That's when God came down on Mount Sinai and laid down the law, so to speak, and said, here are the rules for this society. So at that time, anyone who had come out of Israel would have heard the instructions of the Lord in his own voice, speaking from the mountain, and had heard, these are the rules for this community. Now, those people, I assume, at that point would have had a choice to make. We have just heard the voice of God, and Moses is hearing even more, and he's writing it down, and he's telling us, this is what we have to do. I assumed that people at that time had to toe the line, had to follow these instructions.
I wouldn't think they'd be too worried at that point because they had been a part of walking through the Red Sea and then having the people from Egypt.
Yeah.
swallow
It
up.
certainly would have been
They
impressed
should have
upon
saw
them, having gone
the
through
power
the
of God.
plagues of Egypt and having seen the chariots in the Red Sea and having seen some of those miracles in the wilderness. Certainly they would have been impressed and probably been like, yes, we're
Probably been
used.
afraid to turn back at that point.
They probably would have been afraid of this God. And clearly, yeah. Jared, Jimbo?
Yeah, Matthew 1 says Solomon, which is like Shlomo or peace, Shalom, was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, who was the father of Dan.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Matthew 1, she's in
The genealogy of
She's
the
in
Messiah, yeah,
there's
absolutely.
two genealogies,
Yes.
and she's in the royal side of it, things. And
Yeah.
It's interesting, Boaz was one of the best men that ever lived, and righteous, and probably was head of the Sanhedrin, which they had decided that morning that because Israel was slouching toward immorality, that they would greet people in the name of Yahovah, and not as Elohim, or Adonai, but as the tetra. They were going to use that word, the unspeakable word.
Yeah.
And that's what he did when he entered his field. He greeted everyone in the name.
I remember that, yeah. Interesting.
And
Interesting.
that Rahab was his mama.
Yeah.
He had a whore for a mama. And he became a great man.
Yes.
Isn't that
So
amazing?
poetically.
And
Isn't that amazing?
he's very poetic. He's poetic, isn't he? Well, I'm going to. That was a great insight, Jimbo. And
It's
on
a
that,
wonderful thing. It's wonderful.
it's wonderful. And on that note, I'm going to transfer us into chapter 7.
All right.
We have spent enough time in chapter 6, and I think we have gleaned some good things. There are probably still many things in that chapter that we have not yet touched on, but that's for another time. I'm going to go ahead and present again and go back to my presentation notes so that you can see my translation of Joshua chapter 7. Okay, let's see. Here it is. Oh, what is it? Oh, you know what? We read chapter 7 last time. And so what I'm doing is I'm starting in chapter 7, verse 7, to kind of get to some of these other points, because I think we dealt just a little bit with the very first chapter, the very first part of the chapter. So chapter 7, starting at verse 7, it says, "But the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things under the ban. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zavdai, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, took some of the things under the ban, Therefore the anger of Yehovah burned against the sons of Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth Aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, "Go up and spy out the land." So the men went up and spied out Ai, and they returned to Joshua and said to him, "Don't let all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men may need to go up to Ai. Do not make all the people toil up there, for they are few." So about 3,000 men from the people went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. The men of Ai struck down about 36 of their men and pursued them from the gate as far as Shevarim, and struck them down in the descent, so the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth with his face on the ground before the ark of Yehovah until the evening, both he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. And Joshua said, "Alas, O Lord God, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan, only to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us? If only we had been willing to dwell beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say, since Israel has turned their back before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name?" So Yehovah said to Joshua, "Rise up. Why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded them. And they have even taken some of the things under the ban, and have both stolen and deceived. Moreover, they have also put them among their own things. Therefore the sons of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, for they have become accursed. I will not be with you any more unless you destroy the things under the ban from your midst. Rise up, consecrate the people, and say, 'Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, for thus Yehovah, the God of Israel, has said, there are things under the ban in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you have removed the things under the ban from your midst. Now in the morning, then, you shall come near by your tribes. And it shall be that the tribe which Yehovah takes by lot shall come near by families, and the family which Yehovah takes shall come near by households, and the households which Yehovah takes shall come near man by man. It shall be that the one who is taken with the things under the ban shall be burned with fire, he and all that belongs to him, because he has transgressed the covenant of Yehovah, and because he has committed a disgraceful thing in Israel." So Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near by tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. And he brought the family of Judah near, and he took the family of the Zerahites. And he brought the family of the Zerahites near man by man, and Zavdi was taken. He brought his household near man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zavdi, the son of Zerah from the tribe of Judah, was taken. And then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, I implore you, give glory to Yehovah, the God of Israel, and give praise to him. And tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me." So Achan answered Joshua and said, "Truly I have sinned against Yehovah, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight, that I coveted them, and took them. And behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent, with the silver underneath it." So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in his tent with the silver underneath it. They took them from inside the tent and brought them to Joshua and to all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before Yehovah. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him. And they brought him up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, "Why have you troubled us? Yehovah will trouble you this day." And all Israel stoned them with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. They raised over him a great heap of stones that stands to this day, and Yehovah turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore the name of that place has been called the Valley of Achor to this day. That is very, very interesting. There's a lot of very fascinating things there, and we don't have a lot of time to deal with all of them, but I want to point out just a couple of things. Here's something that came to my attention from Grant Luton. This is a little chart that you can see on your screen. And remember that you can pin this to your screen and see it in larger scale. This is a comparison contrast of Rahab versus Achan. And there's some interesting similarities and differences. It shows an interesting menorah pattern, if you want to put it that way. I'll read through them for you, and this surely would bear out further study. It says that Rahab was a Gentile zonah, either an innkeeper or a whore, one or the other, and Achan was an Israelite warrior. She hid the two spies, and he hid the banned items. She put them on her roof, he buried them under his tent. She brought her family life. He brought death to Israel. She was saved. He was destroyed. She is part of Israel to this day, and Achan is a warning to this day. She was removed from Jericho. He was removed from Israel. She is commemorated in the Hall of Faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 12, and he is commemorated by a heap of stones in the valley of the troubler. These are just interesting parallels that you see in these two stories of Rahab and Achan. So that's a fascinating little dichotomy that you see there. So I'm going to stop that presentation so I can see everybody again. That's fascinating stuff. But I think a couple of notes regarding this thing with being under the ban and him having taken some of the things that were under the ban. One of the things that certainly snatched my attention was that Joshua seems to carry out the ban that was mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. It says explicitly that when you come into that place, that none of the inhabitants of the places that you destroy are permitted to live. You must kill them all. So that is why I think that Joshua carried out that instruction. Now, as to why he decided that those things needed to be under the ban, so to speak, and that the Israelites could not take any of them, that's a different question. God did say that the people in these cities are not allowed to live. However, he did not say you're not allowed to keep some of the loot. Because in the other cities that they destroyed, yes, they killed the inhabitants, but they were also able to take some of the loot. So why did Joshua decide that this particular place was going to be under the ban and everything was going to be dedicated to Yehovah? That's a question that scholars don't have the answers for. However, I suggest that perhaps a couple of things are possible. Number one, that this is like a first fruits offering. It's possible. It seems in line with the first fruits offerings, that this is the first place that they come across in the land that has been promised to them. And as an offering, Joshua decides to enact this ban, this law of cherem, to offer up to God everything. It's almost like the 10%. It's a tithe, so to speak. Possibly that. Number two, it could be that warrior angel thing that he met instructed him to place things under the ban, but it's just not mentioned in the text. We don't know. The rabbis actually believe that the reason that everything in Jericho was given to the ban is because the destruction of the city and the fighting took place on the Sabbath day. The seventh day is when they circled that city. Now it says on the seventh day they circled the city. Is that the seventh day of the week or the seventh day of circling the city? The rabbis say, well, it's because that took place on the Sabbath day, that is why those things are dedicated to Yehovah. I thought, oh, that's an interesting proposition. Nobody can tell, but those are the three ideas that I came up with. Jimbo?
It seems like God really doesn't like Jericho. He didn't want it rebuilt.
Yeah.
But we see that, it's in the New Testament.
Yeah. It was rebuilt at the loss of that dude's kids during the period of Ahab.
So maybe the demon that's attached to that location is just really a guy that God doesn't like. and he doesn't want him to have any authority. He doesn't want a city built there. And
Well, and that's a good insight, and I think it has something to do with what this city represents. I think, and I don't know, Angela's nodding her head because this is one of the parts that her and I were talking about, and it seems to be something about. You want to say anything about that, Angela? It's tied in with the observations that were made during the study of the book of Jonah, that it was like that great city, that there's something about this, there's a certain spirit that inhabits certain places that just makes them completely unclean. And I don't know if that's not the whole point of what we were talking about, but that's my one perspective. Angela?
It doesn't have to do with a geographical location. It has to do with
The spirit of the city.
over it.
a group of the great city, which I said was a group of people in rebellion to God. And so I know we've done so much talking about how Rachab was a harlot and some of the other things that aren't mentioned there. Maybe we should have asked ourselves, why are certain details actually mentioned? Why does it even tell us about Rachab? Because they could have conquered Jericho without her help. Why does it tell us she was a whore? Why does it tell us about her family being saved? Why mention those things? They seem almost irrelevant to the storyline because they would have conquered Jericho anyway. And I think if you even look at that chart that he just put up, I think the reason why it says those things about her is because we have a woman who has had multiple lovers, who then attaches herself, who is rescued out of a city that is burned, Babylon in Revelation, and then attaches herself and becomes a part of Israel. And I think that's us. Rahab is us, and how we, yes,
how do you get in?
Rescued is a piece of it, but then there's outside the camp, and then there's entering the camp. And so just getting rescued from the flames of hell is only step one. And I think that's why it tells us those things about her, so that we would see ourselves in that and the process of becoming a part of Israel.
Agreed.
Coming out of the great city.
Yeah.
Would you say that moving toward our Hebrew roots is how you enter the city, as opposed to staying on the outside?
I think I would characterize it as moving closer to the center of the city, maybe. Yeah.
I see that also becoming problematic, because why don't you then look at this other dude who was a part of Israel, and maybe what he did? I think you do have a minority here. You have someone who is not a part, and how they become a part, and have someone who was a part and thought they were all that. No, wasn't. And so there's a real cautionary tale there about respecting God. And
yeah, and as we get a little deeper into what happened in this scene, and we will have to spend time next time talking about this because there's just so much here. Jerry? I want to bring something to your attention before we wrap up, because it's getting a little bit late. And that is to consider some of the words of this portion that deal with who did what and who is blamed and who suffers the consequences. Okay? Because you notice that one guy stole some loot. All of Israel, 3,000 of the warriors of Israel are chased away like bees. 36 of them die. God says on 2 separate occasions in this dialogue, the children of Israel have sinned. They cannot stand before their enemies. Why is this spoken of in this way when it's only one man who stole some stuff? There's a bigger lesson here, and I want you to just contemplate that. I'm not going to get into my notes on that, but that is a big thing that needs to be examined really carefully. So we will dig through that next time, but I want you to think about that and write that in your notes so that when we get together next time, you'll be able to maybe have some thoughts that maybe you can share, because something is going on there. What is it? Why is it mentioned in this way? So that's something we'll have to look at. But I'm going to go ahead and end right there. I appreciate your good attentions and your good discussion. I think there was good learning here today. Any comments, questions, or concerns for the good of the order? Okay. Continue to pray for one another, to lift up those who are sick. Just be encouraged, be strengthened, continue to pray. Jimbo?
It mentions that the silver's underneath twice.
Yes, it does.
I don't know why.
Keep that in mind.
I don't like it.
He said it mentions that the silver was underneath twice. That is true. I mean, in the text it mentions that the silver is underneath twice. So that's one of the things we'll have to take a look at. All right. Well, let's pray and we'll wrap up.